We thought that we'd have this little gathering because Secretary Rumsfeld's book has not been getting very much attention. So we thought that we'd make up for that by at least having one event. I know that you're not doing anything else to make sure that the book gets the attention it deserves. It's appropriate that we're doing this here in the National Constitution Center because one of the things that the founders were serious about was, unlike the regimes in Europe that they were starting this country to be unlike, they wanted to make sure that we had a record of our leaders, what they thought about what they did in office, and also they hoped that that record would be open as soon as possible.
You might want to wait and get him to quiet down.
I think, can everyone hear? I think there's some question.
There's so much noise over to the right.
Yeah.
Oh, is that what it is?
Well, I guess it's a big crowd of people trying to get upstairs, which for an author is news you'd like to hear, so we'll just speak loudly. In any case, they hope that we Americans would have access to what our leaders thought and what they did as soon as possible so that we can learn from their successes and their shortcomings. And as I was saying, Donald Rumsfeld's book is very much in that tradition. I'm glad it's published. I think you are too.
Thank you.
The book is on Mr. Rumsfeld's entire life, but thought we'd begin by talking about Iraq and then work backwards. A great deal of the book is about Iraq. And I guess maybe the way to get into this is, here we are in the Constitution Center. We just passed by a statue of James Madison in the other room. As you know, Madison gave a lot of thought to war and what presidents should do and how often Americans should get into war. If he came back and just asked you to tell him why did we go to war in Iraq, what would you say?
The answer would be that the Congress of the United States passed a resolution overwhelmingly favoring regime change in Iraq in the 1990s by an overwhelming vote, and it was signed by President Clinton. The United Nations issued some 17 different resolutions advising Iraq that they should conform to the resolutions, the requests of the United Nations Security Council to allow the inspectors into their country, to provide the inspectors the information on their weapons of mass destruction. And the United Nations had been repeatedly rebuffed. President George W. Bush made a decision when he first came into office that he was concerned about the fact that Iraq was firing regularly at the United States and United Kingdom aircraft that were supporting the United Nations no-fly zones and patrolling in the northern and southern portion of Iraq. Those planes were being shot at almost every day. The only country in the world that was shooting at American and British aircraft. Over 2,000 times they were fired on. The Joint Chiefs of Staff advised me and the President that they were concerned about the fact that eventually one of our planes, a British plane or our planes, would be shot down and the crews would be killed or taken hostage. Third, the United States Department of State had listed Iraq as one of the countries on the terrorist list. So there were a series of things like that by way of background. Next, the United States Intelligence Agency spent a great deal of time and determined that they were convinced that the Iraqi government had weapons of mass destruction, had the competence to continue developing weapons of mass destruction, and had the capability to rapidly expand those capabilities in the event they decided to do so. You had a country in Iraq that had used chemical weapons on its own people, the Kurds, a country that had used chemical weapons against its neighbor in Iran, and a behavior pattern that persuaded people that they not only had them but would use them. And we were at a point in our country's history where the lethality of weapons had arrived at a point that once you mix them with someone who was willing to proliferate those weapons, and once you give them, allow them to, with somebody who has demonstrated willingness to use them as well as proliferate them, the danger, the lethality was so great that President Bush went to the Congress and told the Congress what they believed.
Was there ever a thought of a war declaration instead of going for a resolution?
No, I don't know. I don't know. That would have been something Department of State would have done with the president, whether they considered
We have not
it.
had a declaration of war since 1941.
Exactly, not
Presidents
since
attended.
World War II. Not in the Korean War, not in the Vietnam War, not in the incursions that President Clinton was involved in.
Does a war declaration make any difference? I mean, would it have brought Americans more into this?
I doubt it. I think that you never know. That's a road they didn't travel, and I can't really say. But I think the resolution passed by Congress, and then the resolutions by the United Nations provided an underpinning. The other thing I would add to the former president is that President Bush and Colin Powell and Condi Rice and George Tenet and the vice president, all of us discussed the hope that there would not be a conflict and that Saddam Hussein could be persuaded to leave the country and not require an invasion of the country. And there were messages passed and requests made, and they were rebuffed. I think that Saddam Hussein very likely was purposely trying to make the world believe he had large stockpiles. I think that he felt that he had friends in the United Nations who might be able to stop the United Kingdom, the United States, and the various other countries that were supporting the coalition and prevent them from going in. And I also think that because President George W. Bush's father had gone into Iraq after Iraq invaded Kuwait and caused them to be removed from Kuwait, but did not change the regime. There's good evidence that Saddam Hussein believed that America would not change the regime, that he would survive even though the United States might come in.
Interesting.
So there were a combination of things taking place that argued for it, and there was a behavior pattern on the part of Iraq, misguided as it turned out, and he refused to leave with his family, which was offered and urged. And I mean, war is the failure of diplomacy.
Right, as you quote in the book. One thing people, I think, will be very surprised to read about is that President Bush never asked you for your advice on whether the country should go to war against Iraq. Would that violate one of Rumsfeld's rules?
No, I don't think so. I think President Bush, I don't know that he asked Colin Powell or Condi Rice or the vice president. He was the president. He was elected by the American people. We had frequent meetings and discussed various aspects of the situation. They worked very hard with the United Nations to try to put additional pressure on Saddam Hussein so that he wouldn't continue to resist. And the president did what a president has to do. He made the decision, and I assume that he assumed that everyone in that group would have argued vehemently if they disagreed, which no one did.
How do you think people in the future will look back on that decision in Iraq?
It's hard to know. You know, the road not traveled is always smoother. And one looks at it and thinks, well, what if and what if? I think that a little known fact is that Gaddafi, the head of Libya, at that point had a very aggressive nuclear program underway. And when the United States went in and changed the regime in Iraq, Gaddafi, who had been working very hard on a nuclear program, very high on the terrorist list, decided that he would forego his nuclear program, and he contacted some Western leaders and indicated, look, I do have this nuclear program. I'm willing to stop it. I'm willing to have it inspected that I've stopped it because I do not want to suffer the same fate as Saddam Hussein.